Martha adjusted the pearl earring in her left ear, gazing at her reflection in the floor-length mirror. The dress fit perfectly sleek, elegant, exactly what she had envisioned when she first imagined walking down the aisle. The wedding was supposed to be intimate, timeless, a quiet but meaningful celebration of love. Italy, a villa overlooking the Amalfi Coast, 70 carefully chosen guests. A ceremony at sunset, the scent of citrus trees in the air. Everything meticulously planned, every detail reflecting her vision, her dream. And then, Judith happened. Judith, with her impeccably styled hair and a voice that could cut glass, had never approved of Martha. A little too opinionated, she had once whispered to a cousin at a Christmas party, just loud enough for Martha to hear. Independent women are exhausting still. Martha had convinced herself it didn't matter. She and Adam were building their own life, and Judith's approval wasn't a requirement. That was before she realized that, in Judith's world, control wasn't given, it was taken. It started with small things. A suggestion here, a recommendation there. A guest list that suddenly included people Martha had never met. A florist with better taste than the one Martha had chosen. A menu that simply had to be French cuisine because Italian was too predictable. At first, Martha pushed back. She had no problem asserting herself, and Adam always nodded sympathetically, promising he would talk to his mother. But nothing ever changed. The changes kept happening, gradually, subtly, as if she were a guest at someone else's event. Then, one morning, Martha woke up to an email. Finalized wedding plans attached. Excited for the big day. Love, Mom, Dad. She had stared at the screen, the email address confirming what she already knew. She clicked the PDF. The wedding was no longer in Italy. It was now in Manhattan, at an extravagant hotel ballroom, Judith's choice, naturally. The guest list had doubled. A full orchestra was booked. The decor was excessive, the theme ridiculous. There was even, God help her, a seating chart dictated by social status. The cherry on top, her wedding dress, the one she had spent months selecting, had been replaced. Judith had picked something else. Something Martha wouldn't be seeing until the morning of the wedding. When Martha confronted Adam, he had the audacity to look relieved. "I knew you'd be upset," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "But you've been so stressed, and Mom, well, she just handled everything. You don't have to worry about a thing anymore." Martha had stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It never came. "Handled everything," she repeated, her voice eerily calm. "Everything." "She just wanted to help," he said, looking suddenly defensive. "She has experience with these kinds of events. You're always so busy with work. And honestly, does it really matter where the wedding happens? The important thing is that we're getting married." That was when something shifted. A slow, crawling realization. He knew. He had known about it for weeks. He had let it happen. Martha said nothing. Not then. Not when Judith arrived later that evening, swanning into their apartment as if she owned it, talking about the most exquisite monogram napkins and how wonderful it was that everything was finally coming together. Martha didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just smiled, nodded, and let Judith believe she had won. But inside, something sharper than rage settled in. A single, crystal-clear thought. "You want control, Judith. Fine. Let's see how much you enjoy it when you have nothing left to control." Martha didn't speak about the wedding for days. She let Adam believe that she had accepted it, that she had caved like he always assumed she would. She let Judith prattle on during dinner, discussing seating arrangements and the exquisite chandelier that was being installed in the ballroom, all while sipping her wine and nodding in all the right places. She even smiled when Judith patted her hand and cooed, "I knew you'd see reason, dear. You're so practical. That's what I like about you." She let them think she had surrendered. Because that's what they expected. Then she checked her bank account. The wedding fund, meticulously saved over the years, was gone. All of it. Martha felt a strange kind of stillness settle over her as she scrolled through the transactions. Deposits made to event planners she had never heard of. An astronomical fee for a venue she had never approved. Tens of thousands of dollars moved without her knowledge. She knew Judith had been meddling, knew she had taken over, but this was theft. And Adam had let it happen. She closed her laptop and set it aside. A quiet rage pulsed through her veins, not the explosive kind, but something colder, heavier. She sat there in the dim light of their apartment, hands resting in her lap, heart beating in slow, measured beats. Adam came home an hour later. He walked in, loosened his tie, and kissed her cheek absent-mindedly, as if nothing had changed, as if their life was exactly as it should be. "How was your day?" he asked, heading toward the kitchen. "Fine," she said. "I checked our wedding fund today." There was a slight hesitation in his movements, a fractional pause before he opened the fridge. "Oh," he said lightly. "Yeah, Mom took care of everything. You don't have to stress about any of it anymore." Martha let that sit between them for a moment. The casualness of it. The sheer audacity. "She took care of it," she repeated. Adam grabbed a beer and turned to face her. "Yeah, she did. And honestly, it's for the best. You were obsessing over every little detail, and now we don't have to worry about anything." Martha tilted her head slightly. "We." Adam sighed. "Come on, Martha, don't do this. She meant well. She always means well." Martha let out a breath of laughter, low and humorless. She stood up, walked over to him, and took the beer from his hand. He blinked at her in surprise. "Tell me something," she said, placing the bottle on the counter. "When exactly did you decide that my opinion didn't matter?" Adam groaned, rubbing his temples. "Martha. Was it when I told you I wanted an intimate wedding? Was it when I spent years planning this? Was it when I said I wanted my parents and closest friends there, not your mother's business associates, and some senator she's trying to impress?" Adam shook his head, exasperated. "It's just a wedding. That was it. The final nail." Martha inhaled deeply and smiled. "Okay," she said softly. "Then let's not make a big deal out of it." Adam frowned. "Wait, what?" "You're right," she said, picking up the beer again and handing it back to him. "It's just a wedding." The relief on his face was almost laughable. He had no idea. The next morning, Martha called her bank. Then she called her lawyer. Then she called an old friend, one who specialized in high-level financial audits. By the end of the day, she had all the information she needed. Judith wasn't just controlling. She was sloppy. She had spent years playing puppeteer, using money as both carrot and stick, making people owe her. But Martha wasn't someone you owed. Martha was someone who made you pay attention. And Judith was about to learn exactly how expensive her interference would be. Martha poured herself a glass of wine that evening and sat by the window, watching the city hum beneath her. The pieces were in motion now. Judith had taken her money, had taken her wedding, had taken her choice. Now Martha was going to take something back. And she wasn't stopping at the wedding. Martha played her role perfectly. She let Judith continue believing she had surrendered, sitting through tastings, fittings, and endless discussions about floral arrangements she had no intention of approving. She nodded at the right moments, feigned interest in lace patterns and centerpiece options, and even let Adam think she was finally relaxing about the wedding. Meanwhile, she worked in silence. The first step was information. Judith had built an empire out of control. She dictated social circles, managed assets, made strategic alliances that had nothing to do with personal affection and everything to do with power. But power required leverage, and leverage required vulnerabilities. Martha found plenty. Judith's business dealings weren't clean. The country clubs she and her husband owned had immaculate reputations on the surface, But beneath the polish were cracks, financial records that didn't add up, misplaced funds rerouted through personal accounts, shell companies that existed on paper but had no real purpose. Judith had spent years weaving a delicate web, ensuring she never got caught in it. But Martha? She had spent years learning how to unravel webs. She wasn't impulsive about it. She wasn't reckless. She was patient. First, she made contact with an associate and old mentor who specialized in financial restructuring. A simple inquiry, nothing too specific. A friendly chat over lunch about private clubs, about real estate investments, about how fascinating it was that certain people always seemed to find ways around regulations. Just enough to plant seeds in the right minds. Then, she watched. Judith had become comfortable in her power, and comfortable people made mistakes. It took 2 weeks before the first piece fell into place. An anonymous tip reached one of Judith's key investors, someone with far less patience for financial discrepancies. Martha heard about the meeting through a third party, an offhand comment at a dinner party about how interesting it was that a routine audit had been triggered. Martha only smiled, sipped her wine, and listened. Then came the tax review. Judith barely noticed at first, too busy micromanaging every aspect of the wedding. She had no idea that Martha had already arranged for a secondary audit to be conducted, one that would require detailed reports on assets, liabilities, and expenditures. Then the real fun began. One evening, just as Martha returned from another tedious meeting about seating arrangements, Adam mentioned it casually, unaware of the chaos brewing. "Mom's been stressed," he said as he flipped through a magazine on their couch. "Something about the club's finances being under review. I told her not to worry, probably just standard procedure." Martha barely looked up from her phone. She hummed. She was ranting about someone poking around where they shouldn't be. Adam snorted. Said it was probably some jealous competitor trying to dig up dirt. Martha bit back a smirk. Judith was getting nervous. Good. The cracks started showing in her carefully composed facade. Small things at first: tension in her voice, distracted responses, a missed appointment with the wedding planner. Then larger things: abrupt phone calls during family dinners, last-minute cancellations of events she never would have missed before. Still, Martha said nothing. She let Judith spiral, let the pressure mount. It wasn't enough to watch her worry. No, Martha needed her to lose control. So she went after the thing Judith valued most: her reputation. A carefully crafted whisper here, a nudge there. Conversations with the right people, the ones who mattered in Judith's world, the ones who would never outwardly betray her but who thrived on gossip, on subtle shifts in power. "She's under audit," one woman murmured at a charity gala. "That's surprising. She always seemed so meticulous." "I heard she had to pull out of a deal last minute," another mused over champagne. "Such a shame. I wonder if she overextended herself." Martha watched as the murmurs grew, as the uncertainty took hold. And then she made her next move. She pulled out of the wedding. Not loudly. Not dramatically. No confrontation, no screaming match. Just a quiet, precise cut. She walked into their apartment one evening, set her engagement ring on the counter, and looked at Adam, who blinked at her in confusion. "Martha," he said slowly. "I'm not doing this," she said simply. "Not with you. Not like this." Adam stared at her, mouth opening, then closing. I don't understand." Martha tilted her head slightly. "That's the problem, Adam. You never understood." He looked at the ring, then back at her, as if waiting for some kind of clarification. "I'll have my things packed by the end of the week," she said, voice eerily calm. "Judith can have her wedding. I won't be in it." Adam exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "Jesus, Martha, this is insane. Over a wedding." Martha let out a breath of laughter, shaking her head. This was never about the wedding. And with that, she left him standing in the kitchen, staring at the ring she would never wear again. She had cut the rope. Now she was waiting to watch Judith fall. Judith didn't notice Martha's absence immediately. Not really. She was too preoccupied with putting out fires, financial ones, social ones, the quiet but growing unease in her business circles. The audit was proving to be more than just a routine review. And investors who had once praised her management skills were suddenly asking pointed questions. Still, she had no reason to suspect Martha. Why would she? Martha was just the girl who had finally seen sense, who had let go of her silly little dream of a destination wedding and embraced the grandeur of a real society event. Judith assumed she had won. Then the ring arrived. A small velvet box placed delicately on the dining room table, accompanied by nothing more than a note. "I won't be needing this." Adam had barely looked at her when he dropped it off. He had been stiff, distracted, answering in clipped sentences when she asked what had happened. "She's leaving," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "It's over." Judith had been stunned at first, then furious. It made no sense. Martha was practical. Women like Martha didn't walk away from good marriages. And Adam needed her. Judith knew her son well enough to recognize that he was not a man who functioned alone. "She's throwing everything away over what," Judith hissed later that evening, pacing in front of the fireplace. "She didn't say," Adam muttered. "She must have said something," Judith snapped. Adam looked at her then, and for the first time in weeks there was something raw and angry in his eyes. "She said I never understood." Judith scoffed. "Oh, for God's sake. You don't let a woman like Martha walk away without knowing why." Adam didn't respond. It should have ended there. Martha should have faded into irrelevance, another foolish girl who didn't understand her place in the grander scheme of things. Except things kept getting worse. The audit had been an inconvenience at first, then an irritation. But now it was escalating. Documents were being pulled that should have remained buried. Figures that should have balanced were coming up wrong. A concerned client had anonymously tipped off an ethics committee regarding the transparency of Judith's financial operations. The whispers were growing louder. At a gala, a longtime investor of hers clinked his glass a little too sharply against hers, then leaned in with a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you're having a bit of a headache," he murmured. Judith's smile didn't falter. "Nothing I can't handle." And then he said something that made her blood run cold. Shame about Martha, though. Smart woman. Can't imagine letting someone like her slip away. There was something knowing in his voice. Something pointed. Judith's fingers clenched around her champagne flute. Martha. She had assumed Martha was simply licking her wounds somewhere, moving on, disappearing. But that comment, it was too deliberate. It was a reminder. Martha hadn't disappeared. Martha was watching. And that meant she had done something. Judith left the event early, phone pressed to her ear before she even reached her car. "I need everything on Martha," she snapped at her assistant. "Work history, contacts, everything. I want to know where she is, who she's meeting, what she's doing. And I need it now." But Martha wasn't so easily traced. Judith combed through Adam's texts, his emails, anything that might give her a thread to pull, but Martha had left nothing. It was as if she had anticipated this. And that was when Judith finally felt it. The creeping, suffocating sensation of losing control. She had never lost before. Not really. But this time something was different. The cracks in her empire weren't superficial. They were structural. And deep down she knew. Martha hadn't just left. She had walked away and set the match to the foundation on her way out. Judith gritted her teeth and slammed her phone onto the desk. Fine. If Martha wanted a war, she'd get one. Judith always believed that control was something permanent, something unshakable. It didn't matter if people resented her methods, what mattered was that they obeyed, that they understood who held the power. But power was a fragile thing, and Martha had found the cracks Judith hadn't even known existed. The Financial Review had escalated into a full-blown investigation. Tax discrepancies, missing funds, questionable real estate transfers, things that had always been handled quietly were now being dragged into scrutiny by people Judith couldn't ignore. Calls that once went answered were now met with vague responses. The bank had requested additional documentation for accounts that had never needed oversight before. And then, the worst blow. The city council rejected her latest business expansion proposal. Unanimously. Judith sat at the long mahogany table in the council chamber, surrounded by polished bureaucrats who, up until recently, had always made things easy for her. This was supposed to be routine, a formality. She had backed half the men in this room during election cycles, attended their wives' charity events, donated to their causes. Yet now, the air had shifted. The smiles were polite but distant. "We appreciate your contributions," Mrs. Lambert, the chairman, said, folding his hands over a neatly stacked file of reports. "But given the recent financial inconsistencies, we feel it's in the city's best interest to pause any new developments tied to your businesses until the audits are complete." Pause. No approval. No access to the millions in funding that had already been lined up. Judith's jaw tightened. This is ridiculous. These audits are standard reviews. They don't indicate wrongdoing. Of course, the chairman said smoothly. But we have to be prudent. Prudent. A word that meant they were distancing themselves. A muscle in Judith's jaw twitched, but she didn't argue. Not here. Not in front of them. She only gathered her things, stood up, and walked out, head held high. But as soon as she stepped into her car, she dialed Adam. She did this. Judith snapped before he could even say hello. Adam sounded exhausted. "Mom." "Don't mom me," she hissed. "Martha did something. She's behind this. She's been working against us this whole time." There was a long silence on the other end. And then, the worst thing he could have said. "I don't think she ever wanted to be against us," Adam murmured. "I think we pushed her there." Judith felt something in her chest tighten. "We." "She left, Mom," he said. Voice quieter. "She left me. She could have made this personal. She could have ruined me, but she didn't. She only went after you." Judith's grip on the phone tightened. She had underestimated Martha. She had thought the girl was practical, predictable, someone who would get angry, maybe cry, maybe throw a fit before slinking away. Instead, Martha had walked away with absolute silence and let the walls collapse behind her. And now, Judith was the one standing in the wreckage. Judith sat in her office, staring at the reports spread across her desk, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the polished wood. The empire she had spent decades constructing was unraveling, piece by piece, and the worst part. She had no idea how deep the damage truly ran. Every call she made was met with hesitance, every meeting filled with polite evasions. Investors were reviewing options, business partners were restructuring priorities. She knew what those words really meant. They were abandoning her. The realization settled like lead in her stomach. This wasn't just an unfortunate setback. This was calculated. A dismantling so precise, so methodical, that it could only mean one thing: Martha had known exactly where to cut. And then, the final blow landed. Her private banker called. "I'm afraid we need to discuss the status of your liquid assets," he said, voice measured, careful. "There have been some irregularities in your accounts that require immediate attention." Irregularities. Another meaningless word meant to soften the impact of something far worse. Judith leaned forward. "What kind of irregularities?" A pause. A breath. And then, your credit has been frozen pending further review. We've also been advised to put a hold on all new transactions tied to your personal and business accounts. For a moment, Judith couldn't process the words. Excuse me. We've received multiple legal inquiries regarding your financial structure. Given the circumstances, we have no choice but to comply with the investigation. The walls closed in. Her bank accounts, her access, her power. Gone. Judith barely heard the rest of the call. She could only sit there, gripping the phone, breathing hard as the full weight of what had happened crashed down on her. Martha had done it. She had won. Not with scandals, not with public humiliation, but with quiet, ruthless precision. She hadn't needed to scream or threaten. She had simply pulled the right threads and let Judith's world unravel on its own. And the worst part, Judith hadn't seen it coming. The invitation arrived on a crisp white card, handwritten in elegant script. A private event. Intimate. Exclusive. Judith held it between her fingers, reading the details again. The location was familiar, one of the most prestigious private clubs in the city. Her city. A place where she had once been greeted with warmth, deference, admiration. But this wasn't just any event. This was Martha's event. Judith had spent weeks clawing at what remained of her influence, trying to salvage the reputation she had once held unshakable. But the world had moved on without her. Without her money to keep people in line, without her name commanding the same weight, people had started treating her like just another forgotten figure in the background. But Martha? Martha had stepped into the spaces Judith had once ruled. She had no need for theatrics, no desperate grasping for lost control. She had simply become the one people now sought out, the one they trusted, the one they respected. And now she was hosting an evening for her circle, her investors, her partners, the very people Judith had once counted among her own. Judith almost threw the invitation away. Almost. But then, something in her burned with curiosity. She arrived late, slipping into the event unnoticed, keeping to the edges of the room. It was strange, this feeling of being an outsider in a place where she had once owned the room. But no one turned to greet her. No one rushed to acknowledge her presence. And then she saw Martha. She was standing near the balcony, dressed in sleek black, wine glass in hand, listening intently to someone who was now leaning in, as if her opinion mattered. Because it did. Judith watched as Martha laughed at something, head tilting slightly, eyes alight with something calm and assured. Power. A real power. The kind that couldn't be bought or bullied into submission. For the first time in her life, Judith understood what it felt like to lose. Not just a deal, not just an investment, but everything. She had spent her whole life believing that control was the only currency that mattered. That without it, people like Martha, smart, capable, but not ruthless, would never survive. But Martha hadn't needed to play Judith's game. She had simply rewritten the rules, and she had won. Judith turned and left without another word. No one stopped her. No one even noticed she was gone.